Well, the topic of this paper on paper is what is living and what is dead in the Southern tradition. I was going to go through a number of things that were living and dead, but I've focused on one topic, and it might be called the Southern critique of totalitarianism when there wasn't any totalitarianism. In other words, they could see something coming down the road. The Atlantic Monthly in the 1990s described Eugene Genovese as the greatest living American historian in the 20th century. Genovese, a Marxist who converted to Catholicism, wrote insightfully about the South and slavery. In the Massey lectures given at Harvard, he excoriated the campaign by academic media and political elites against the South as a, quote, cultural and political atrocity, while ignoring its many achievements. One of the most valuable, he thought, and the topic of this talk, is that the South, quote, mounted the first native-born critique of the totalitarian tendencies that have run wild in our 20th century. The word totalitarian was coined by the fascist regime of Mussolini in the early 1920s. It meant an ideology that would bind the various strains of society, political, economic, social, moral, religious, and other important strains, together under central authority. Later examples being Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, Mao's China, and so on. To establish these regimes, tens of millions of people died, not in war, but in revolution and ideological cleansing. Communism alone took 1 million lives in the 20th century. But there's a scholar named R.J. Rummel, R-U-M-M-E-L, who argues that governments have killed more of their people in the 20th century than all the wars fought around the world. So the state is a problem in itself. For example, about 1 million people died in Lincoln's War to prevent secession. It was not about slavery, it was about preventing secession. That's more than all Americans lost in all of our wars. What was the greatest threat to life in the United States at that time? The mismanagement of government. The Southern critique was not aimed at totalitarian regimes because no such regime existed at that time. There were tyrannies, but they were not totalitarian. But there were intimations of such a regime and a rising form of political association unique to Europe, which scholars call the modern state, end quote. It was first systematically theorized by the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes in his book Leviathan, published in 1651, which I shall take as the exemplar of the modern state. This state has a structure that opens the door to total control of society unless sufficient checks are instituted, and it is disposed to discourage or even eliminate those checks. Can't always succeed, and usually doesn't, but it is disposed. But what exactly is a modern state, and what did it seek to replace? The Europe in which Hobbes' book appeared in 1651 was grounded largely in the political philosophy of Aristotle, modified by Christianity. Hobbes went out of his way in the book to single out Aristotle as the arch enemy of the modern state he was theorizing. His book was rejected at the time by the learned world, but it struck a chord in some people, which generated a quarrel in Europe over the modern state, they didn't call it that, and Aristotelian criticism of it. By the time of the French Revolution, it was a quarrel largely won by Hobbes. Let us begin with Aristotle. Aristotle holds that man is a social being and that political society springs from that social nature automatically, like a natural language. The task of politics is to discern, cultivate, explain, and protect the virtues and excellences that arise from a critical examination of social activity in all its forms. In contrast, Hobbes holds that political society is not natural to man, but is an artifact of the human will. It exists only as long as that will can sustain what it has created. The reason is that man, for him, is essentially egoistic and without fear of an external force would be in a state of anarchy, in constant fear of a sudden and violent death. So anarchy is not a good thing. The solution is an act of the will whereby an aggregate of egoists are willing, out of enlightened self-interest, to transfer all of their absolute power, to do as they please, to a man or group of men who receive a legally irresistible and infallible power to rule over them in order to escape anarchy and to enjoy a degree of civil association. What prevents this from becoming an insufferable totalitarian regime? We've already got the format. Hobbes' answer is revolution. Just as enlightened egoists will the state into being out of fear of each other and to escape anarchy, so the sovereign fears revolution and out of self-interest is inclined not to go too far beyond agreeable rules of civil association. But what is to prevent a clever ruler from gradually rigging the rules to build a belt of force and security around himself that would make revolution too costly for timid Hobbesian subjects? That's the problem. Being an extension of Europe, Americans participated in this quarrel between Hobbes and Aristotle in the form of two conflicting visions of what America is and ought to be, which I symbolize as Jeffersonian and a Lincolnian vision. I argue that the Lincolnian vision presupposes a Hobbesian understanding of what political reality is, along with its totalitarian intimations. That's where Lincoln's coming from, or the Lincolnians. Whereas the Jeffersonian posture presupposes an Aristotelian criticism that illuminates the Hobbesian totalitarian intimations. The Southern critique that Genovese praised is part of the Jeffersonian critique of the modern state in its Lincolnian embodiment. And it had a widespread acceptance throughout the Union. It wasn't just Southern. But we can call it the critique Southern only in the sense that Southerners provided most of the intellectual and political leadership and defended it with treasure and blood. So the South was the unquestioned leaders. These include St. George Tucker, who wrote the first commentary on the Constitution, Jefferson, Madison, Spencer, Rowan, Abel, Upshur, Calhoun, and the framers of the Confederate Constitution. They're all part of this Southern critique. Three conditions are necessary for totalitarianism that emerged of the totalitarianism that emerged in the 20th century. The first is that the central government has a monopoly on coercion in a territory. In other words, it's the only source of authority in the regime. There are no competing authorities. Second, the regime must be gigantic in size. ruling tens and even hundreds of millions of people. I mean, small states can be tyrannical, but they can hardly be totalitarian, or they could be called totalitarian. You need massive revenue and infrastructure. Third is ideology, how we think about political reality. The regime rejects, the totalitarian regime rejects critical engagement with tradition as a guide to conduct in favor of an abstract universalist ideology. We shall see that none of these conditions obtain in the Jeffersonian Aristotelian vision of America. They're just not there. In what follows, I will take these three conditions in order. First, the central government has the monopoly on coercion. Lincoln affirms this in his first inaugural, where he says, as one of his reasons for invading the South, quote, "Anarchy is the essence of secession," end quote. The reason for this is Hobbesian. The reason is that Hobbesian government is an artificial thing created to escape anarchy, the worst of all evils, and therefore is the only authority in the territory. If there were another authority that could challenge the center's authority, that would open the door to civil war and the path to anarchy. So we just can't have that happen. We don't want to go back to anarchy. The second is ideology. By the 1830s, the aggressive captains of the Industrial Revolution were bumping up against the Constitution. They needed more centralization. They wanted a modern state in America as existed in Europe, especially after the French Revolution. Now, if the Constitution was limited and defective in certain ways, then the thing to do would be to call a constitutional convention, debate the matter, as the founders did when they abandoned the Articles of Confederation, give the reasons why it's defective, and come up with an agreement. It might be there's no agreement, in which case you might decide just to divide the Union. That would be a solution. Or you might be able to work out a solution with the Union intact. But that's what should happen if you really think it's defective. But these people who were opposed to the Constitution, they didn't say that, they couldn't say that, but they were, and they acted that way. They wanted a shortcut. Why slug through years of trying to change the Constitution through debate? Lincoln served them by arguing that, and he wasn't the only one, but by really forcefully arguing publicly that the Constitution was never a compact between the states. The states were never sovereign political societies. And he put this by saying, the states did not create the Union created the states. By union, he means a union of individuals, not a union of political societies. These are the egoistic Hobbesian individuals who formed a national American society, which authorized the Constitution, which specifies that the states are like counties. They're administrative units of the national will. That's what they are. And that's what Lincoln taught. He described the states as, quote, counties. Well, a county is an artifact of a legislature. The legislature of South Carolina can abolish every county and redraw the map or have no counties. So a county is not sovereign. So Lincoln told a lie about the Constitution. That's a very serious thing, especially if you launch a war on the basis that the states are not sovereign and they're engaged in treason. And then 1 million people die. And half the country believes patriotically that it's a compact between the states. For example, Daniel Webster's son wrote him and said, I don't have the quote here, but he wrote his father, who gave speeches arguing that the Constitution was not a compact. And he said, after reading, he said, I read your book. And he said, I never thought that. I always thought it was a compact between the states. This is what the son told Big Daddy. He thought it was, well, you know, it's a compact. Now, ideology. Lincoln, 1838, gave a speech arguing that this United States, which has expanded to 3 times its size in 50 years, think of that, all the way to the Pacific, sprawling all over the place. He said it could be, tradition and religion could not hold it together, nor the constitutional history. The only thing that could hold it together is a, quote, political religion of the nation, end quote. Got to have a political religion. And Americans of all stripes should worship constantly at its altars, quote, altars. Now, this political nation comes to life again in the Gettysburg Address, where Lincoln says America is founded on an idea, a proposition, abstract proposition that all men are created equal and endowed with natural rights. That's what an American is. After World War II, it became fashionable to say that America is not a culture or set of cultures. It's not a tradition or traditions. America is an idea, a self-evident principle which we are applying to the world. We are an exception to the rest of the world. They're dragging along with their traditions and all, but we've cut loose from that. We are an idea. How many people have I heard say, to be an American, all you have to do is subscribe to the ideas. Doesn't matter where you come from or anything, your character or anything. That's it. That's what an American is. Now, that view was not challenged by mainline historians. In fact, it's a kind of script of American sacred writings. The Gettysburg Address is like part of the gospel of America, of the political religion. The people who criticized it were Southerners who found it absolutely unpatriotic and revolutionary. And people like H.L. Mencken, he wrote a nice little piece ridiculing the Gettysburg Address. But now, recently, there are liberal and progressive constitutional scholars who say that these criticisms by Southerners were right. Noah Feldman at Harvard wrote a book called The Broken Constitution, and he says Confederates were right to criticize Lincoln for all sorts of unconstitutional actions. George Fletcher at Columbia Law School says that Lincoln, he wrote a book called Lincoln's Secret Constitution. Got a secret one. That Lincoln had a secret constitution which guided him along with the botched constitution that the founders settled. And Gary Wills writes that that the Gettysburg Address was a great open-air swindle. Quote, everyone in that audience was having his pockets picked, end quote. Now, they don't stress this mendacity in Lincoln and the Lincolnians, not just Lincoln. They don't stress the mendacity of it as a fraud on the people, of a constitutional fraud on top of that. Rather, they see Lincoln as a great statesman. He stepped outside the box, gave us a much better constitution, a modern state that was able to abolish slavery. You had to have a modern state in order to do that. So Lincoln is praised as a kind of Napoleonic figure. You know, at some point, he takes control with his secret constitution. So that's a kind of interesting twist that's happened. I'll say also about ideology, I forgot to mention this, in that 1838 speech where he says we need a political religion of the nation, he describes this political religion as based on nothing other than, quote, cold, calculating reason, end quote. In other words, this is a religion that will appeal to all the egoist individuals in America that live by contracts, out of fear of each other. This is something they can understand. It's enlightened self-interest. So the national political religion will be a religion of enlightened self-interest. Okay, I come now to the final three conditions for totalitarianism, and this will take a little more time, and it's great size. Totalitarian regimes are huge. Soviet Union, China, the United States, Germany, they're large things. Hobbes went out of his way to stress that the modern state was big in scale. He called his book Leviathan, which is a biblical word for a large sea monster, that you can't hook this rascal. He's too big. That's the Leviathan, that's the modern state. The Americans, however, who began America, favored small republics, not big but small. And they were inspired by Aristotle and the ancient Greeks. Now, the Greeks hated monarchy, and by 1800 they had gotten rid of all their monarchs. None. You think we don't like monarchy? The Roman republicans and the Greeks hated monarchy. And large centralized states. So Greece built a civilization of around 1,500 small republics strung out in the Aegean from around the Aegean from south of Italy to the Black Sea. This was a unique civilization. It was a brilliant civilization, but it was not centralized. There were temporary alliances and so on, but they basically tried to remain independent. The largest of these, one of the largest, was Athens with around 300,000 people. So this shows you that a great culture can be produced by a small state. They have to trade with other states, but the political state itself is small. Moreover, for centuries into the modern period, most republics were relatively small. But near the end of the Middle Ages, and especially with the Protestant Reformation, a larger size of republicanism emerged, which I will call Aristotelian federalism. So now we're going to get a republic that's larger than Athens, 300,000. It's going to be larger. Well, how's that going to work? An exemplar is Johannes Althusius, dated 1563 through 1638. He's a generation before Hobbes, a German Aristotelian Calvinist who proposed a federation of small Aristotelian-sized republics united under a central government with limited powers. The central government was kept within its limits by numerous checks that the republics could impose in their corporate capacity, not as individuals, but in their corporate capacity. And one of these was the right of secession. A republic could secede from this federation, and everybody knew it. Althusius seems to be, might not be, but he seems to be, to me, the first to build in a right of secession in the organic law of a regime. And like a good Aristotelian, he also argued that the federation itself should be limited. Can't be big. He said it should be of medium size. Didn't explain that, but medium size would probably be something like Switzerland or the Netherlands, both of which were at that time federative type polities, about the only ones in Europe, if we exclude the Holy Roman Empire, which was not republican.
About a century after Althusius, another philosopher, Francis Hutcherson, 1694 to 1746, a Scottish Aristotelian Calvinist himself, wrote a book called A System of Moral Philosophy, published after his death, a few years after his death, in 1755. Now, in this book, he has a chapter titled, When It Is That Colonies May Become Independent, end quote. When did they become independent? Why is he asking this? In it, he argued in Aristotelian manner that a colony is a natural thing. Remember, for Hobbes, all political order is artificial. It's a natural thing. And not an artifact of British sovereignty. And it develops over time and can reach a point where it is capable of and deserves independence. Just as a boy naturally reaches a time when he secedes from his parents and starts a family on his own. He's not committing treason. He's just, he's just doing what comes naturally. So the South was doing what comes naturally in the American system as understood in this Aristotelian way. The great Scottish philosopher David Hume, who acknowledged Hutcherson as his mentor, or one of his mentors, wrote in his memorandum sometime between, now notice these dates, 1729 to 1740, he kept this memorandum. And in it he said, quote, the English colonies in America are almost completely independent of England, end quote. Being almost independent is not being independent, but it's almost. In other words, there's something in process here. It's going to have a completion. So 30 years later, in 1768, Hume supports secession for the colonies. 1768. That was before most Americans thought of secession. In 1775, Hume wrote to one of his friends, his publisher, quote, I'm an American in my principles and wish we would let them alone to govern or misgovern themselves as they see fit, end quote. So who was the first American? It was Hume. That's playful speech. Now the important point here is that Althusius, Hutcherson, and Hume have a philosophical mind about what political reality is, right? And they have a mind that enables them to perceive that a colony is a political society, even though it is still an artifact of British sovereignty. No question that the colonies are artifacts of British sovereignty. But at the same time, that doesn't mean they're not natural things. I mean, your son or daughter is under your authority, has very little authority, but he's a human being growing. And at some point, he's going to be a political society of his own, so to speak. So that's why I mentioned those figures, to show you there's another way of thinking about this than the way Lincoln and Hobbes think about it. Now, the Republican tradition taught that if a republic grew too large, it would face the fate of the Roman Republic, which got so large that it led to civil war, collapsed into an empire or an oligarchy, however you want to describe it. And Americans were worried about this because they took classical republicanism seriously, and they were very tuned to the notion of size. Well, it was too big. They had a continent. But although the continent was huge, the political societies were very small. In 1776, the largest city was Philadelphia with 30,000 people. That's the biggest one. Well, I mean, we've got a lot of small republics here. New York didn't get the size of ancient Athens till around 1830. So, how are they going to be Republican with all this territory? Well, Virginia paved the way. Having conquered the vast Northwest Territory from Britain, larger than France, Portugal, and Spain put together, it's a lot of land, but the Virginia Assembly ruled that Virginia could not both be a republic and rule such territory. Lead us not into temptation. Our Father who art in heaven, lead us not into temptation. So they ceded the territory to the Confederation on the understanding that people could freely settle, form political societies, secede from the Union, and ask to be accepted as an equal sovereign state in the Federation. Eventually, 5 states in time emerged from the Northwest Territory through secession and acceptance into the Union. 5 years later, Virginia was still too large, and they allowed their a number of their western counties to secede and form the state of Kentucky. Well, Jefferson thought it was still too large. And what should happen is not to divide the state, but to divide it into ward republics. These were little, small republics with considerable sovereignty. They were not counties, they were little sovereignties, like the Swiss cantons or the New England towns. The New England towns, some of them had a certain kind of sovereignty for a while. But secession did not end there. Because remember, we're moving all the way to the Pacific, 3 times our size in 50 years. What a rollicking thing. It's not just that new states were formed out of larger states or out of federal territory. So vast was the Continental Territory that it could not be governed effectively from the central government and should be divided into a number of federations of states, perhaps along 3 commercially valuable waterways, yielding, for example, an Atlantic Federation, a Mississippi Federation, and a Pacific Federation, one looking east, one looking west, and one looking south through New Orleans. This was suggested, or things like that. There were many suggestions of how this could be done, but it was just too big to be ruled from the center. Now, this was the natural Jeffersonian way of dealing with republicanism and size in the America of that time. But Lincoln was a Hobbesian and did not think in that way. He refused to receive Confederate commissioners to negotiate an equitable division of what was clearly a dysfunctional union. In a speech to Congress, he observed that if population growth continued, the U.S. would equal Europe by around 1930 and could become one of the world's great empires. This would be a vast centralized empire with a monopoly on coercion at the center, and would be sure to develop the internal structure of a possible totalitarian regime unless there were sufficient checks. Jefferson also wanted an empire. Jefferson was criticized by the New Englanders for getting the Louisiana Purchase territory. They said Virginia wants to be the Austria of America. It's going to have this big Austrian-style empire. And so Jefferson is awful. But Jefferson said, no, yeah, we're going to have an empire, but it's going to be, quote, an empire of liberty. Those were his words, an empire of liberty. What did that mean? That meant that states could secede, that the Union might divide into 2 unions or 3 unions. It would be an empire of liberty, vast but Republican and ruled by Americans. Our own children will be out there in these various empires. So that was his vision. But he was not the only one. Senator Thomas Hart Benton told the Senate that when we get to California, you must understand
They will secede and form their own government. We can't rule them. Allen Gallatin, James Madison, John Quincy Adams, Gouverneur Morris, Jefferson, and others seem to support some such plan. Now, the most developed form of the Southern critique was the Confederate Constitution. Madison argued for interposition, meaning that a state did not have to enforce a federal law by using its military and courts to enforce it. In other words, it could acknowledge the law is a valid federal law, but we're just not going to help you enforce it. If you want to come in here and enforce it, you can. We won't do anything because it's a federal law, but we're not going to help you. You can't use our courts, you can't use our water fountains, you can't use our highways, you can't. In other words, these are all Virginia things. We're a sovereign state, that's our business. You can't do that. Well, the federal government cannot enforce its own laws for the most part. It doesn't have the manpower to enforce these laws in the various states, and it doesn't have the money. In the marijuana case in California, Congress outlawed medical marijuana. Supreme Court upheld the outlaw of medical marijuana, and California said, "All right, come in and enforce it." And the pharmacies wouldn't do anything. And Obama sent a few people in to try to do it. They arrested some pharmacists, but they didn't have enough men and money, so they backed off. Other states looked and said, tell you what, we're just going to legalize marijuana, period, for the fun of it, just to have fun. And they did. And so one after the one, states defied Congress and the Supreme Court, not by saying it's unconstitutional. It's constitutional, we're just not going to help you enforce it. And today, most everybody believes that a state has the right to legalize marijuana, don't you? Don't most everybody believe that? But at this time, Alabama passed a resolution that they did not allow medical marijuana, but they passed a resolution supporting the right of California to not enforce it. But now today, I don't know, I don't know what Alabama, but you see, my point is the Constitution changed because the states pushed back using Madisonian interposition. Nullification is another thing. That's where the state says you've crossed the line into reserved territories and your bill is null and void, and we will not enforce it, nor will we let you enforce it because it's null and void. And we have a constitutional obligation to protect the people of our state, and you've intruded. We have to stop it. We have to use force. That's what nullification says. So there's those two kinds of interposition. And there are other kinds of ways the states can resist yet to be figured out. But those were two. Now the Confederate Constitution came on the scene, and it inherited all of this, and it put it together in a single constitution. I'm just going to run through a few of these forms of resistance. I hope I'm not getting carried away here. Let's see. Okay, here are a number of them. First of all, to control centralization, the Confederates realized you need to reduce the power of Congress to spend money. If you turn off the revenue supply, they can't do much. Hitler couldn't do much if you turn off his revenue supply. He's got 80 million people paying taxes. That's a lot of money. So what the Confederacy did was you had to have 2/3 vote of Congress for a spending bill unless the president made a special request, and that had to be ratified by a tribunal in the Senate. Spending on internal improvements was strictly forbidden, as well as bounties for business enterprises. Forbidden also were earmarks to a spending bill that had nothing to do with the topic. How about that? That's a bright idea. And the president was given a line item veto and a single 6-year term. The Jeffersonians had paid off the national debt in 1835. paid it off. And as of 1860, the debt to pay for the Mexican War was around $65 million, about the same as the cost of the federal government the year before at $60 million. Today the debt is $37 trillion. The Hobbesian state begins to develop. Monopoly on coercion begins to develop. A belt of security is put around the center, and the people become timid Hobbesian subjects, not about to revolt. The Lincolnian tradition, what time is it? I'm sorry. Let me look at this. 17:45. Oh, right. Okay. Okay. What else in the Confederate Constitution? Oh, yes. The Confederate Constitution allowed any state to impeach any federal officer in the territory to be tried in the Confederate Senate. So it's not Congress that impeaches federal agents, it's the states. So another one is this is, I think, the most important. Any 3 states, there are 11 states, any 3 states can propose a constitutional amendment, and Congress has to call a convention to vote it up or down. So let's say a comparable percentage of states today, maybe 13, could propose an amendment. We're going to constitutionalize gay marriage, or we're going to constitutionalize same-sex normal marriage, and the people of the states would have to vote on it. We don't have anything like that. The states have no say in initiating amendments that are binding on a vote. As to slavery, as to slavery, there was little difference between the U.S. and the CSA Constitution. The CSA Constitution did not mandate slavery, it left it up to the states, it abolished the slave trade, and allowed the entrance of non-slaveholding states. And they expected non-slaveholding states to come in along the Mississippi River, states like would want to come in, like Illinois perhaps, or some of the others. State secession was recognized. I don't have time to go into this, but in the antebellum period, there was hardly any time in which people were not talking about the possibility of dividing the Union. The thing wasn't finished. It was in process. It was very much a frontier, had a great frontier. It was in process. It didn't have to all be centralized. All right. The quarrel that I've laid out between Aristotle and Hobbes over the nature of political reality, is it an artifact of egoistic individuals, or is it a natural thing which has a culture, which is understood in terms of degrees of excellence and virtue and all of those things that go into a culture as part of political order, which Aristotle has. Hobbes has none of it. And he's got it down to bare bones egoism. Now this quarrel in Europe spilled over in America, and when we had our war between the states, the Europeans looked at America, which was an extension of them. Many of them admired America and wanted to learn from their republicanism, because they were sick of monarchy. A lot of them were sick of monarchy. Republicanism was in the air, and America was a very interesting place. So we had our war, people perked up, and Europeans divided. There were liberals, like the London Spectator, which said in 1866, quote, "The American Revolution moves on to its conclusion, the destruction of a federal commonwealth in favor of a modern nation state, quote, one and indivisible," end quote. So rah-rah for the progress in the North. By the way, Francis Bellamy, who wrote the Pledge of Allegiance, he explained that he wrote it to explain the meaning of the war, which he said reduced to 3 words, the whole thing: one nation indivisible. Not slavery, one nation indivisible. And you had to suppress secession to do that. Europeans such as Lord Acton wrote, secession filled me with hope, not as the destruction of democracy, but as its fulfillment. That's the opposite of London Spectator. And Tocqueville, who admired the right of state secession in his visit to America, he comments on that, bitterly lamented at mid-century what was happening to Europe. And I want to read this passage rather carefully. Quote, the old localized authorities disappear without either revival or replacement. And everywhere the central government succeeds them in the direction of affairs. The whole of Germany, even the whole of Europe, presents in this respect the same picture. Everywhere, now listen to this, everywhere men are leaving behind the liberty of the Middle Ages. Not to enter into a modern brand of liberty, but to return to the ancient despotism. For centralization is nothing else but an up-to-date version of the administration seen in the Roman Empire, end quote. Now, what did he mean by the liberty of the Middle Ages? He didn't mean, Black Death and, and all those other things. What he meant was it was an Aristotelian fair. There were many small political societies, principalities, dukedoms, bishoprics. Some of them were awful, some of them were good, but there was a mosaic of polities. Germany, as of late of 1700, was around 300 little countries, some principalities, some free states, and so on. Robert E. Lee wrote to Lord Acton that the destruction of state sovereignty and transfer of a monopoly on coercion to the central government meant that the American regime henceforth would be, as you all know this quote probably, tyrannical at home and aggressive abroad. Ever heard of the global American rules-based order? That's the first global empire in history. So we began as small republics and we end up with an empire bigger than anything that's ever existed. It hasn't lasted too long, but there it was. So let me end with an eloquent statement about the meaning of the war by Alexander Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy, in his book on the constitutional cause of the war. Quote, depend on it, there is no difference between consolidation and empire, no difference between centralism and imperialism. To speak of any rights as belonging to the states without the innate and inalienable sovereign power to maintain them is but to deal in the shadow of language, without the substance. The states under our system possess no rights but sovereign rights. End quote. Or as Jefferson put it in the Kentucky Resolutions in 1796, the states, quote, are not united upon the principle of unlimited submission to their general government, end quote. And if they're not so united, the only way that makes any sense is to say they have sovereignty sufficient to push back. And see, even Madison's little weak pushing back is part of presupposes sovereignty. You can at least do that. By the way, the Supreme Court has upheld, it's called the non-commandeering cases. There are about 5 of them.
The federal government cannot commandeer you to use your facilities to enforce a federal act. But they hedged that around a little bit, and it's been a pretty close vote. So tomorrow, the Supreme Court could do away with that. So there's not true sovereignty. True sovereignty would mean that if the court did that sort of thing, the state could secede. That would not be a radical thing to do. That would just be the next move in the constitutional game. It's like California took that move. By the way, today, throughout the United States, medical marijuana is illegal and upheld by the Constitution, illegal. But also some of the states can sell can have medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. We've got. Is that incoherent? No. It's just division of powers. So if you try to buy cocaine, it's getting late and I'm getting crazy. If you try to buy cocaine in one of those states, you can't use a credit card because you cross federal lines. And it's illegal to buy marijuana. Don't you know that? So you pay cash. Then everything's okay. So that's how you have to pay cash. It's still against the law. So that's a wonderful system. But the Hobbesian is horrified at that. Because if you can do that, then you can do other things. The whole thing will come apart. Because remember, political order is artificial. It's held up by a will. And you can't let these wills get out of hand. The whole thing will fly apart. Whereas the Aristotelian doesn't see it that way. He sees political society as a kind of, this is a stylized Aristotelian. I know Thomas Fleming is going to get all over me about talking about classical figures, but this is a stylized, Christianized maybe Aristotelianism. But John Witherspoon put it nicely during the Confederation period when they were trying to figure out what to do. Ben Franklin said, well, if we get independence, we're going to meld the states together with a bond of iron. Witherspoon said, no, each colony is a distinct person. See the difference? We're going to weld them together. No, each is a distinct person. You can't just weld them together. You got to get cooperation. So Witherspoon sees the states as persons. We don't have trouble seeing corporations as persons, right? They can sue you. They can own property. They can do all sorts of things because they are persons. But a state's not a person for Lincoln. It's an artifact. Okay, I'm through with that. Just one other quote from Friedrich Hayek, Nobel laureate in economics. He was also a critic of the modern state from a different point of view, and he says this. He doesn't say he's doing this, but he's returning back to the Aristotelian notion that there is a limit of size in respect to political order, because everything in nature has a size beyond which or below which it becomes dysfunctional. Quote, "We shall not rebuild civilization on the large scale. It is no accident that on the whole there was more liberty, more beauty and decency to be found in the life of the small peoples, and that among the large ones there was more happiness and contentment in proportion as they had avoided the deadly blight of centralization." Now, one final word from Stevens, and then this is it. Stevens was not sanguine about the future. He could see what was happening in Europe. Remember, Tocqueville is saying the whole of Europe is being Hobbesianized? That was written in the 1850s. He dies in 1859. So Stevens is gloomy, as was Tocqueville. Stevens says, "If centralization is ultimately to prevail, if our entire system of free institutions, as established by our common ancestors, is to be subverted,
and an empire to be established in their stead. If that is to be the last scene in the great tragic drama now being enacted, then be assured that we of the South will be acquitted not only in our own consciences, but by the judgment of mankind of all responsibility for so terrible a catastrophe, and from all the guilt of so great a crime against humanity, end quote. Thank you.